Arnett. I serve as Academic Director of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second session in our inaugural quasi-seminar series. These seminars are designed as debates on important topics related to social innovation. Our aim isn't to convince you that a certain perspective or answer is correct. We're not here to crown winners in these debates, as tempting as that can be. Instead, we want to enrich and refine the research questions that scholars use when they study these topics. As editors, reviewers, readers, writers, and teachers of the material underlying these debates, we know all too well that too much of the literature focuses on uninteresting questions that only rehash and rename established ideas. It's our sincere hope that by pointing out what is known on all sides of a debate in very pointed and direct ways, that we can drive researchers to produce sharper advances in our understanding of how to help business to better serve society. Today, we debate the question, is capitalism the most effective way to advance society? Answering in the affirmative is libertarianism's Waco kid, Peter Klein. Answering in the negative and giving us 199% is the left coast's leading light, Paul Adler. Arguing that it depends, hailing from the Great White North, and rounding out the newly formed scholarly touring trio of Peter, Paul, and McGahan, it's Anita McGahan. And last but far from least is the Italian stallion of strategy turned British bulldog. It's Maurizio Zollo. Is there any better group for this topic? This is awesome. Each in turn will argue their position. As they do so, please stay muted and post any questions or comments in the chat box. When we get to Maurizio, he'll synthesize and extend the arguments, as well as offer his own perspective. But primarily, the open discussion will occur after all four of our presenters have spoken in the half hour or so that will remain thereafter. So let's get the party started. Over to you, Peter.
Wow, what an intro. Thank you, Mike. Can you see the slides, everybody? Yeah, the only thing that was missing was the music, the lights, the fog machine. We could have really gotten us off on a lively, even livelier note. But it's a great pleasure to be here, especially to be on this panel, not debate, but discussion dialogue panel with my good friends and colleagues, Anita, Paul, Maurizio, and Mike. I started to title this presentation as Capitalism, the Most Effective Way to Advance Society. Heck yeah, but I thought that would not be professional, so I just made it yes. I think the answer to this question is unequivocally in the affirmative. The only thing to discuss is the details. What form of capitalism, what kind of capitalism do we want? And I'll explain why I mean that in just a moment. But let me start with some definitions, right? What do I think capitalism means? What is capitalism in the context of this discussion? Capitalism is a system in which resources, in particular the means of production, along with other resources, are in private hands. So any system that features private ownership of resources is a capitalist system. Capitalism is also characterized by resource allocation through the price mechanism, prices, markets and prices, capital and labor being free to migrate from one line of production or one team or group or area to another, and high levels of economic freedom to set prices and to choose production levels and so forth without government interference. In my own research and teaching, I typically don't use the word capitalism. Capitalism was actually meant as a smear term that was used by Marx and his colleagues to criticize the market system. I just use terms like free enterprise or the market economy or the private enterprise system, the liberal economy, liberalism, or really just the free society. Certainly capital plays a very important role in capitalism, but so does labor, so do resource owners, so do entrepreneurs. We could just as easily call it laborism if we wanted instead of capitalism, as long as we're talking about a society that has these features. What are the alternatives to capitalism? Well, the most popular alternative is socialism, historically speaking. Socialism is defined as a system where not private individuals, but the state is the owner of the means of production. resources are allocated not by prices and markets, but by the actions of government, by governmental fiat. Capital and labor are not mobile. They are placed where the state wants to place them. There are very low levels or even the complete absence of economic freedom. I want to make it clear that socialism does not mean high levels of welfare spending. Many capitalist economies around the world have high levels of welfare spending, so-called social safety nets and so forth. Capitalism is not, doing things together. Capitalism is not collective action. Socialism is not collective action. There's all kinds of collective action voluntarily. There's spontaneous coordination and so forth in a market capitalist system. Sometimes when I talk to my students, millennials, Gen Zs, they think that socialism means something like being sociable, being kind to other people. Well, that has nothing to do with socialism as an economic system. So even in the US, people like Bernie Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez are not socialists in the classic sense, even though they use that language. They're in favor of capitalism with high levels of welfare spending and a substantial role for government intervention. By the way, to follow up, we could talk about different types of capitalism, sort of pure free market capitalism, where the government only plays the role of the night watchman, as the classical liberal economists, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and so forth would describe. This is the role of the state you get in Hayek or Milton Friedman. There are some scholars who argue that even the night watchman function can be performed through private, non-governmental action. Most capitalist economies in the world today are best described as mixed economies. They're essentially capitalist, as defined before, but they do have some state-owned enterprises. They may have high levels of social welfare spending, like the Nordic countries. They may have substantial degrees of economic regulation, but they still meet the definition of capitalism that I gave before. So just to clarify, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, those are capitalist countries. In fact, in many ways, they're more capitalist than the US or Western Europe or Canada, in that they actually rank higher on the most economic freedom measures than countries like the US. Capitalism can be, quote unquote, socially responsible. Stakeholder capitalism, stakeholder-oriented capitalism, is a kind of capitalism. It is not an alternative to capitalism. And of course, in a free market, free enterprise system, people can form cooperatives. You can have worker-owned firms, family firms, communes, kibbutzim, socially oriented ventures. We can produce goods and services in households rather than factories if we want. As long as we have private ownership of resources rather than state ownership, we have capitalism. Capitalism can also take the cronyist variety, where the state intervenes to favor politically connected firms. In my view, that's a distorted or a corrupted form of capitalism, but it's not socialism. Okay, so my three claims that, as requested by Mike. Number one, capitalism, I'll call it entrepreneurial capitalism, is the largest wealth creator in human history. In my mind, this is the killer, end all, drop the mic argument for capitalism in favor of socialism. Maybe you've seen a picture like this, right? You've heard of the so-called hockey stick graph associated with climate change. This is the hockey stick graph that matters for humanity more than any other. If you look at attempts to measure GDP, this is total global GDP from the year zero until our day. Basically, what you see is that throughout most of human history, people have lived at a subsistence level. It was only in the last 2 to 3 centuries, with the scientific and commercial and agricultural revolutions, and then most importantly, the Industrial Revolution, that we saw this unprecedented exponential growth in living standards, right? People today have come to expect that the quality of life, that the material standard of living will systematically get better year after year. And we complain that we only have 1 or 2% growth instead of 4 or 5% growth. We complain that the iPhone 12 is not sufficiently different from the iPhone 11, but throughout most of human history, people never had any expectation that they would live better than their children, that their children or grandchildren would live better than they did. What explains this sharp increase in human living standards? Capitalism. the disruption of feudalism and monarchical systems and the rise of a private property, market-oriented system. That is the universally accepted explanation for this exponential growth in the standard of living. If you want to see it in per capita terms, you see the same kind of picture, varies slightly whether you're looking, whether you're, depending on what part of the world you're looking at, but we see the same hockey stick type graph, no matter how we slice and dice the data. If we want to look at measures of health and well-being, like poverty, we've seen a huge decline in poverty since the start of the 19th century. You've probably seen these pictures before about the declining share of people on Earth living in extreme poverty as defined by the World Bank. Here's another version that shows the increase in total population since 1820. And as you can see, the share of people living in extreme poverty has plummeted relative to what it was throughout most of human history, right? That is the product of capitalism. We can look at life expectancy. I mean, we could spend the whole session, we could spend hours going through these graphs, and we would get the same picture that by any reasonable measure, the quality of life has increased dramatically since we transitioned from pre-capitalist society to capitalist society. Maybe you've seen this famous picture of the Korean Peninsula at night. Right here, you see two communities, shared history, shared culture, shared religion, shared ethnicity. The only difference is you have capitalism on the south of the 38th parallel, and you have socialism to the north. And this is what things look like. This is what civilization looks like after hours. As I mentioned before, the explanation for this exponential growth and the reason why it occurred in Europe and not in China or Africa or the Americas has been thoroughly explored by historians and economists and legal scholars and anthropologists and sociologists. And there's pretty much a consensus that what used to be called the European miracle, I suppose they don't use that term anymore, it explains why capitalism and the increase in living standards occurred when and where they did. So Europe, unlike Asia, for example, was characterized by it starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even earlier, a system of private property, and most importantly, a world of limited government where you had divided sovereignty. You had national governments, but a transnational church where authority was shared. This limited the ability of the sovereign to intervene in the economy. That, combined with the rule of law and cultures that promoted entrepreneurship and innovation, explain the rise of the West or the rise of living standards in these capitalist economies. Whether you look at Douglas North and or Nate Rosenberg, David Landis, Joel Mokyr, any of the accomplished social and economic historians, this is pretty much the consistent story that they tell. As I mentioned before, capitalist economies tend to be characterized by high levels of economic freedom. That's something that we can measure. There are a number of attempts to measure it. The Fraser Institute puts out the most comprehensive annual measure of what they call economic freedom around the world. The World Bank has its own measure. Other groups attempt to measure this as well. Lots and lots of empirical studies, almost all showing a very positive, statistically significant and robust correlation between economic freedom and all kinds of measures of economic, social, and cultural well-being. There just really isn't any dispute about this in the empirical literature. Of course, the decline in global poverty that we've seen, particularly in the last half century or so, a lot of that, of course, is occurring in places like China and India. Why have we seen sudden declines in global poverty in those countries? Because they have become more capitalist. And by the way, they're also using more fossil fuels. Everybody hates fossil fuels, but fossil fuels provide cheap energy. They provide for climate control, industrial production, improvements in healthcare, and that's really what's driving increases in the standard of living in those places. What's holding back economic development in other parts of the world is the lack of capitalism, in particular, the lack of secure property rights. Hernando de Soto, the great Peruvian economist, wrote about this in his country and in Latin America, and you can see an interesting piece that was in The Economist just a few weeks ago on the lack of property rights in developing countries, how that's holding us back. Okay, point number two.
Run out of time, Capital.
How much more time do I have, Mike? Zero?
0. Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. So you want me to just stop, or you want me to take one more minute?
30 seconds.
30 seconds. My second claim, there's really no alternative to capitalism. Socialism is not an economically feasible system. We're having this discussion on the 100th anniversary of one of the most important articles in social science in the 20th century, the article by Ludwig von Mises published in 1920, showing that rational economic planning is not feasible in the absence of private property and a price mechanism. People talk about, well, couldn't we just have socialist firms kind of operate like capitalist firms? Well, there's this famous phrase that was popularized by Ronald Coase in his 37 piece, the firm as an island of socialism, that only works surrounded by the sea of the market. You still need external market prices for firms to be able to calculate. Paul will disagree with this, but I also think there's a strong correlation between capitalism and private property and all of the other liberties that we think are important.
Time being a scarce resource and such. Can you just flip
I'll
to
stop by
what
saying,
okay.
Socialism in Nozick's famous phrase would forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults. I think that's a problem. So Mike, you asked us to end with research questions. Here's my research question. What is the role of the institutional environment in promoting a dynamic entrepreneurial form of capitalism? I think those are the kinds of issues that we as scholars should be focusing on. My apologies for running over time.
Thank you very much, Peter. We'll then move on to Paul.
Thank you, Peter. That was a tonic, bracing, very helpful setup for where I wanted to go. Sorry we didn't get to the second part of your presentation about the infeasibility of socialism, but let me share some screen with you all. Forgive me if I do it in this clumsy format, but it'll be good enough. So yeah, I was going to frame my answer much the same way Peter wanted to do his. My answer was going to be hell no. So I decided to be a little bit more professional. Surely not. And my pitch today is in favor of democratic socialism. A form of socialism which, broadly speaking, I accept Peter's characterization of the nature of socialism as a system. The democratic form of socialism, I don't think we've seen on the planet anywhere. I don't think it's infeasible, and I'll try to convince you why we need it and how it might work. Let's see if I can get this moving here. Here we go. No, that's not what I want. That's what I want. What's wrong? There we go. Why can't I get this happening? I'm sorry. Forgive me. There we go. Yes. So let me go backward. Here we go. Okay, now I've got control of my system. The strange thing about the question is I don't doubt for a second, Peter, that capitalism is way more effective as a system, as a way of advancing society than was tribal societies, societies based on slavery, societies based on feudalism. There's no doubt in my mind that any sane person's mind that capitalism is a huge advance over those prior forms of organization. The idea that it should be the last and best form of society that humanity can invent for itself, it's like, that's a weird idea to even entertain. It's like, oh, we've gotten to capitalism, so history is going to stop. Maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea if we lived in some wonderful utopian universe, but dang, as I see it, we're surrounded by, whatever form capitalism takes, it brings with it at least 6 crises that I've discerned that seem to be pretty recurrent and often deepening over long period. So if you look back over the last 100 or 200 years, we've got an economic system that seems increasingly irrational, with periodic economic crashes that destroy wealth for millions of people, ridiculous levels of inequality. The level of inequality rises and falls depending on the period, but overall capitalism is associated with just an extraordinary level of inequality where, what do we say, 40% of Americans couldn't come up with $400 without going in further into debt. Whereas eight people on the planet currently own as much wealth as the entire half of the world's population at the bottom end of the scale. Huge amounts of waste, huge amounts of unmet wants. The economic irrationality of capitalism is quite, let's say, galling. In what place disempowerment? I pulled together some data on this a while back. The Gallup folks have a terrific engagement poll, and what they find is that over 50% of employees are not engaged at work. Another 16% are actively disengaged in their work overall in the United States, notwithstanding the massive accumulation of evidence that the way they measure engagement correlates and predicts very powerfully firm performance on all sorts of measures. Government is around the world in capitalist economies quite unresponsive to popular needs. Huge discrepancies documented time and time again between public opinion preferences and congressional legislation. On the environmental front, we could just stop with environment, and I could make my whole pitch based on the environmental unsustainability of capitalism. The climate emergency is upon us, but also industrial pollution, the massive effects of the disrupted nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, the massive loss of biodiversity, also nicely profiled in a recent Economist magazine article. The tendency to social disintegration seems to be quite pervasive in capitalist systems. The recent agitation around racial inequality, I think, has brought to the fore some pretty powerful historical evidence that racial inequality is baked into the foundations of capitalism. Capitalism always needs an other to exploit. And international conflict waxes and wanes, but at a time when we need international cooperation so desperately, the competition between firms is expressed in the competition between states. And that international conflict could well destroy us from one minute to the next with the madman we have at in the White House with his finger on the nuclear trigger. And it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, the worst of it all is that we have the technology and the resources for everyone to lead a dignified life, and instead we're left with this mess bequeathed us by capitalism. There are some plenty good things about capitalism. I don't deny that there are some important positive things, and not just by comparison with feudalism, but also on an ongoing basis. But these crises seem to me pretty fundamental, and I believe they're linked to the core, with the root cause, I should say, as I see it, is their linkage to capitalism in its basic structure. We could walk through all these. We share a basic understanding of capitalism. I'm not going to belabor the point here. I would say, and I think we would probably agree, that whatever capitalism is, ethical business doesn't fundamentally change anything. The way I see it, the space for win-win options of the type that Porter and Kramer talk about with their shared prosperity models, that space is just too small. It excludes the solutions to the really big problems we face. Yes, firms have some room for philanthropy. Sometimes doing good can be good for business, but firms simply can't afford to internalize so many of the externalities that are killing us, unless they're forced to by government regulation, that somehow government blocks the low-road competitors. And then government regulation, I think you're quite right. Capitalist societies are often characterized by high levels of government regulation or social welfare, but I don't see how these get to solve the big problems we face that I talked about a second ago, for reasons that I think are fairly important for our field of research, namely that it's not only does business exert a disproportionate amount of influence on, well, no, let me back up one step. The reason government regulation can't solve the big problems we face is because to solve them requires impacting profits massively across such a wide swath of industry. Just think of the environmental crisis, and that would be the obvious case in favor of my argument here. And to so severely impact the profitability of such a wide swath of industry, that's not possible for any government. That would immediately delegitimize the government. It would lead to business enacting a capital strike or capital flight, as happened to Obama in 2008 when he started envisaging banking regulation, or Mitterrand in France in 1981, where capital fled the country en masse. Social democracy, I agree with you, is a kind of still a form of capitalism, and the record of these Nordic social democracies doesn't give us a lot of hope to overcoming these big problems I'm talking about. That they would represent an important step forward for America, there's no doubt about that. But these are not countries that have demonstrated a way to resolve the fundamental problems of the environment, of wealth inequality, of workplace disempowerment even, of social disintegration, youth unemployment. I mean, I could go on about the social democracies, let's not. So as I see it, to solve these big problems we face, we don't have much choice but to find some way to socialize control over the production and investment decisions of our society. What that means is, instead of private enterprises making these decisions to advance their private profits, we'd have government enterprises cooperating, working towards a national plan. Obviously, and this is the second part of your presentation, which we had unfortunately had to cut short. It's never worked anywhere before. I think that's a very important problem for socialists like me to engage with. But the fact, logically speaking, the fact that it's never worked before doesn't mean that it couldn't work in a different form in the future. And we do have something I've sometimes called our Aristotle problem. It's very hard for us to imagine a world that's so radically different from the one that we're in today, just like it was difficult for Aristotle to imagine democracy, a system that he greatly admired. He found it so hard to imagine democracy working if the franchise were extended to women or slaves, right? In the same way, we find it difficult to imagine democracy working if its compass expanded from the narrowly political sphere to the economic sphere. So in the book that I wrote about a year ago, The 99% Economy, I tried to envisage why we might have some reason to believe that a democratic socialist system of strategic management of the society's entire productive resources might conceivably work. And the argument I laid out in my book was that I picked up on exactly the idea you quoted. Many firms are islands of planning, albeit in a sea of competition. I argue that they try to achieve the same kinds of benefits as socialists are trying to achieve for the whole economy within the firm. The capitalists are trying to achieve the same kinds of benefits through planning as socialists want to achieve for the whole country. They encounter in microcosm the same problems that socialist planning did on a macro scale. But interestingly, among the more advanced firms, they've developed very interesting, innovative techniques for overcoming those problems of planning on a large scale. The implementation of those techniques within capitalist firms is often undermined by the competitive dynamics of the marketplace, by the authoritarian relations of the capitalist wage relationship. But under socialized ownership, I think socialist strategic planning on the economy-wide basis could take those strategic management techniques that we see at work in advanced capitalist firms, deepen the participation element of them, scale them up to enable us to plan entire regions, entire industries, the national, indeed international economy. So what are the goals that we're trying to achieve through strategic management? Mobilize resources to capitalize on economies in scale and scope. Mobilize a critical mass of R&D experts to avoid duplicative effort and reach further out in our R&D horizons. Standardize best practice and components to drive down the costs and buffer personnel from the randomness of the market so they can sustain their commitment to shared goals rather than retreating to their private goals. I think those are goals that firms try to achieve through strategic management within the firm, and perfectly comparably at the societal level, socialists are trying to achieve exactly the same goals through a socialized ownership and control of the country's resources. They encounter challenges. Some of them are well known to the literature you're referring to. The first two speak directly to concerns of Hayek and other Austrians. The third, maintaining efficiency in the face of rigidity, that's a well-known problem in the sociology of work. And the fourth, the question of individualism and conformism. This seems like a problem well studied in the context of organizational psychology. And the solutions are very interesting. We study this stuff, and I think my argument is simple. They can be scaled up. So we're familiar with this kind of planning process. This is an old article from 1974 that describes the iterative process of planning in a big corporation. And these days you can find wonderful expositions of how you could scale that up to plan an entire economy by people like Marta Haneke. I can walk through the rest of these. I'm running out of time pretty quickly, but my argument is simply that in the practice of strategic management, firms are challenged but with the same kinds of challenges socialist planning would encounter at a national scale, and that in the innovative efforts of the more advanced of our firms, we find very interesting innovations that should give us, I think, confidence that socialist system could work. It requires control, it requires ownership. This is not a system that's going to work through government regulation for the reasons we just talked about before. And it requires a real strengthening of democracy, far more so than any previous form of socialism has encountered. I don't think
wrap up as soon as you can.
Sure, 10 seconds, I'll be done. So implications for research. I think I'd say three broad things. Don't confuse capitalist organizations with our efforts in organization theorizing to theorize organizations in general. You saw my 4 key ideas of participative centralization, enabling standardization, integrated specialization, interdependent. These all sound like contradictory, paradoxical ideas. They're only paradoxical in the context of capitalist firms that pull people apart. I think we need to study the ambivalence, the ambiguity of firms' efforts to mobilize employees' discretionary efforts. And I think we need to expand our horizons to political economy. Concretely, I just have three broad areas that I'd love to see more research done on. The structural power of business. Why is it impossible for capitalist societies to overcome these really fundamental problems? It's not just that firms exercise disproportionate power on politics. It's not just the cultural power that's described by neo-institutional theory. It's got to do with the economic power of business. The well-being of the country depends on the profitability of the private sector. As long as that's the case, we're screwed. And I think looking deeper into these strategic management processes in firms for lessons on how to democratize planning on a larger scale would be very cool. And of course, we need a lot more work than I've certainly managed to do on the pathways to change, on what can get us from here to there. So thank you. That's my pitch.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it's interesting that both capitalism and socialism overuse the resources they were allocated. Very, very thank you both. And now we will go to Anita.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and I have the enviable position of arguing that it depends, that the answer to the question is capitalism, the most effective way to advance society, depends. Which is a terrific place to be. I'm in the unenviable position of having to make my argument after that of two of my dearest friends, Peter Klein and Zollo Adler, both of whom I respect greatly. And in the end, I think, we actually, the three of us will agree on many details, but maybe not on some definitions, maybe not on some broad conceptual points. Let's see how we do. So, my argument is going to be that it depends. The essence of the argument so far as I hear them is that, an answer to the question, yes, which Peter argued for, is essentially grounded in this idea that capitalism is the best system available. I think Peter has acknowledged, yes, there are problems, but still it's the best available system. And it's created all sorts of wealth and there's all sorts of advantages to it. And if I understand Paul correctly, what he said is that capitalistic growth is simply unsustainable. We can't continue to live in the system that we're in because of, for example, the climate crisis. Just to say,
Anita, your sound is a little bit in and out. Is it possible? I don't know if you have to speak closer or something. But
okay, how's that? Is that a little better?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so excuse me, I'm sorry about that. So Paul is arguing that the answer is that it's unsustainable. He had 6 major crises that he pointed to. I'll just name the climate crisis, for example. We just can't continue with the current system, and the best alternative is blended socialism. I'm going to say that each of these positions have some problems. I agree with Paul that the current system isn't sustainable. Okay, that entrepreneurial capitalism has created vicious structural inequality, climate suicide, as Jerry Davis, who is here with us, sometimes says, the prospect of climate suicide, and all sorts of humanitarian disasters. Although I agree with Peter that it's also created a lot of wealth. On the other hand, I think socialism threatens democracy, and I think this is a point that Peter has raised. And when I say socialism threatens democracy, what I'm thinking about in particular is governmental control, either through planning or direction or fiat, over privately owned resources. And that's what I'm worried about. I think that concentrates power, it's inefficient, and it puts our civil liberties and freedoms at grave risk. And so that's a problem. But each side, of course, also makes some valid claims. I agree with Peter that democracy is most compatible with decentralized control. I spent the morning talking with some students about these questions. We know that entrepreneurship unleashes creativity and supports human actualization and rewards hard work and challenges authority, all of which I think we need more of as I speak here, especially from the United States, worried about authoritarianism in our country. On the other side, here I agree with Paul that governments are failing to respond effectively to large-scale crises, and we need better planning at the level of government to do that. Here I benefit especially from having read Paul's book and talked with him about this over a period of years, and I recommend this book to all of us. It's so thoughtfully written and argued here, and what Paul is essentially saying is we really need to develop capabilities in government to deploy resources across society more effectively. And I agree with his argument that we need more governmental planning over the deployment of government-owned resources. But I'm in a different place on planning over privately owned resources. I am essentially a capitalist in the sense that I don't want to hand the keys to the car, for example, to the Trump administration on what firms should be doing in terms of production decisions, especially, for example, as an example, and resource deployment. What I think, though, and again, here's where I think we agree, and very strongly agree, that to advance society, we actually need system innovation that goes beyond this false dichotomy that has set up this debate between capitalism and socialism. We need some sort of new way of doing things that preserves the best features of capitalism while protecting against its worst features. And we also need innovation that supports better allocation of public resources, strategic allocation of public resources in ways that are rational and coordinated and kind of up to the challenge of standing against the private sector. In other words, the public sector needs managerial innovation at a very profound level in my view here. Now, there's some well-known linchpins to accomplishing this. Peter alluded to this, and I believe that many of us have talked about this in our publications. There are some well-known arguments that private sector capitalism has to be constrained through effective legislation and regulation. We need more of this. We need smarter regulation of private sector firms to prohibit exploitative resource use, internalize the cost of different types of resources, to reduce illegitimate human resource practices. This is something I've been writing about with Greg Distelhorst at the Rotman School. We need much more deeper and more effective controls over the climate impact of private sector organizations, transparent reporting. There's a much longer list than I have time to cover here, but those types of innovative solutions, I think, are quite legitimate and need to be amplified or need to be developed. So the left-hand side, I want to constrain capitalism. On the right-hand side, I want the government to get better at what it does. I want amplification of government capabilities. This morning's papers are full of coverage over Facebook and Twitter and how they're reacting to the kinds of speech that is occurring here. We need comprehensive safeguards on privacy and data ownership and platform control. These are monopolies. We need to think about whether or not they're utilities and whether or not perhaps they should be publicly owned. I'm not saying they should be, but that's the kind of analysis that we need to consider. We need less politics and more management, a deeper capacity to collaborate across sectors, better planning at various levels of government, city, state, federal levels, international levels. So all sorts of arguments have been made that are aligned with this that I don't have time to cover, but constrain capitalism, amplification of capabilities in government to make government better at what it does, not necessarily bigger, but better. Okay. For me, the bottom line here is that conceptually, the biggest opportunity here is to innovate on fundamentals. We need to think very deeply about governance innovations that can direct all of the good stuff about free market, enterprise, capitalistic activity, entrepreneurship. All of that energy needs to be directed toward resolving climate change and other grand challenges rather than advancing, for example, unsustainable consumption. In other words, we need to come up with new systems, new types of regulations, new types of legislative controls and so on that direct that energy toward productive pursuit of resolution of the grand challenges, in pursuit of the sustainable development goals here. We need institutions that allow us to govern communities that would break in terms of their social fabric if wild market-based unconstrained capitalism were implemented. In other words, if in societies around the world, and I'm thinking here in particular of low-income countries where I've done quite a bit of work, if there isn't a robust system for constraining capitalism, then the implementation of free market systems can devolve into corruption and lots of other problems. So we need to think about what we lose with capitalism and how we can deal with that problem. We need, as I've said, robust public sector capabilities to develop contemporaneously with private sector capabilities. You know, the government is chasing Facebook. Facebook is so far ahead of the regulators on the issues that are on the table here. We need to fix that. We need better digital governance processes. In the end, basically what we need is to think differently about how risk is born across sectors and how that can be internalized institutionally. So lots of work for us to do here to try to innovate at a systems level. I'm not with Paul, with all great respect, on giving the keys to the car to the government on control over the allocation of privately owned resources. But I'm all in on helping governments be better at actually planning the deployment of their own resources. Peter, I'm all in on unleashing private sector enterprise toward productive aims, but not unleashed, constrained so that that energy is directed at what's important. So what's the answer to this question? Is capitalism the most effective way to advance society? It depends on robust institutions that constrain, enable, and especially encourage private sector organizations to act in the public interest. Thank you.
Wow, well within time. I was figuring I was going to have to play the timekeeper as well. But thank you very much, Anita. And now we will move on for the integration and wrap up with Maurizio.
I wonder if Maurizio is muted.
You definitely are muted, Maurizio. Should be a menu on the bottom of your screen, and on the left side is the mute. Nothing. I can still see the mute sign on your presentation screen. You got to find a microphone on there somewhere.
Deborah may be able to unmute him as the host.
Can you forcibly do that, Deborah?
I can't forcibly unmute him. I can just ask him to unmute, but it's not working. Let me see here if I can try to unmute him.
No, nothing, Maurizio.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Now the problem was that I had launched the the presentation, and
it hit the mute.
Of course, it hit my mute. My apologies. All right, so let's see if this time works. And of course, that's great. So what happened here? Is this working for everyone? Can you see my slides?
Yeah, I think you're going properly now. Thank you.
How about this one? Is this okay? Can you see my slide?
Yeah. Mm-hmm, you're good.
So thanks and apologies for this technical issue here. I'm following up on three amazing synthetic views, and quite frankly, it's a irrational idea for me to be able to do a synthesis for all of this. And in fact, I'm going to leverage on the fact that Anita has done an amazing job in synthesizing the strengths and weaknesses of all the arguments. So what is left for me to do is much more humble and just try to provide some ideas about how we can generate maybe some overarching framework and research agenda where we can piece together the two extreme views that we've heard from Peter and Paul, and I would call them extreme just for the sake of the debate. But as we have already seen, there are already a lot of overlapping ideas that are germane to both. The question is, what can we draw in terms of implication from this variety of opinion? Is there a general model? And I will make the argument that this stakeholder capitalism can be considered not just as one special type, but actually as a more general model where there are, both, in fact, the extreme and many other forms of capitalism, including, and this is where I also disagree with Paul, including what he supports and advocates, can be considered special forms. Let me kind of argue and perhaps, and then obviously open it up to a more general debate. I'm not going to go through, the notion, of what we mean by capital, but because there's tons of literature, but it is pretty clear that all depends on how we define capital, and everything that has been discussed so far, essentially narrows the definition to financial capital. We all know that the word capital has been used in many other ways to indicate other essential elements that are essential to both the creation, the growth, and the success of firms, including obviously human capital, social capital, for which Paul is actually one of the best thinkers around. If you haven't read his AMR piece, please do that. And of course, natural capital, all of which have been are invested by different forms, different stakeholders, including local communities that give the license to pollute, give the license to operate, and therefore also eventually even stress and create all sorts of maladies that have been summarized. So the idea from a conceptual standpoint is that essentially systems, socioeconomic systems, can be argued, can be analyzed on two dimensions that we are all in one way or another have already touched upon. One is the fact that,
Can I interrupt for just a second? So you have a reduced version of your screen. If you put
really?
Well, if you push the little presentation thing, you get the whole thing. But do you have only
one?
one?
I'm going to avoid the little presentation. I'm sorry, because I'm actually seeing. That's funny. I'm actually seeing the.
I mean, it shows up fine.
Let me just do this. I'll just. Let me see. It's actually equally fine with me. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect. Well, it's still the same thing. I don't know. At least it has advanced, but it doesn't fill the whole screen. So
I know. But the alternative, I think, I just have to adjust the fact that we're looking at
enough. If it sounds
mirroring the two is not, and we don't have the time, I guess, for me to change the mirroring system. Anyway, I think this is good enough, if you don't mind. So the one dimension is the question of primacy given to the rewards given to the various providers of these different forms of capital. And the other dimension is essentially the degree to which firms integrate public good in their purpose, right? And this is essentially what I mean. If you think about these two dimensions, then the two extreme forms that have been debated and argued for by Peter and Paul are essentially characterized by the same type of assumption that we can give the keys, using Anita's expression, to one of the investors of capital, of different forms of capital, whether in one case is the financial investors, in the other case is the government, right, the local community or national community. And that, we can hope for the best, essentially. By the way, there are intermediate levels where the keys are given to, in cooperative forms, right, to either workers, to clients, customers, to suppliers, right? We know that, and it's been already acknowledged by Peter. But essentially, that's the one kind of, system that is or a type of systems. Of course, there are examples in the history as well as across geography where at least there's been a dual system someone put in place, where actually, for instance, Germany is the classic example. You have both capital and labor, right? Two forms of capital, financial and labor, that are given somewhat equal role in the governance of the firm, right, in terms of interest and claims, at least in terms of governance. Let's put it the way. I mean, claims is different in this case, but certainly the fact that workers control the supervisory board, right, it gives them a lot of powers on all the key strategic decisions. In countries like France and Italy, just to name a few, you have the hybrid where you have private enterprises that have kind of golden shares, for instance, privatized by government, but the government keeps the golden share. Again, the key strategic decisions cannot be made without the consensus of the government. Again, two different forms of capital that coexists in the same form. We are also seeing, at least over the last few decades, the development of more and more and diffusion of forms of enterprise that are trying to balance even more than two stakeholders' interests, giving some level of representation, but as of today, very limited. But certainly, at least in purpose and in terms of measurement of controls of performance, they are giving increasing relevance to social and environmental impacts of interest, of course, to non-financial stakeholders. That has to do with social enterprises, very well known, and exploding phenomenon, as well as the other B form, B corporate and corporations, the stakeholder-centered or stakeholder-oriented form of enterprise. Now, the interesting part here is, and I think, again, drawing to getting close to one of the key conclusions of Anita, the main question is not maybe which one is the best system, okay? The main question is, how do we understand the dynamics and the development, the capacity of the various actors of the system to actually learn essentially how to coordinate and cooperate with each other, and whether the system, as well as the individual actors, can develop those capabilities to collaborate and coordinate in the common interest, which is defined, again, which can be defined in increasing way as the creation of value both for private as well as for public good. Now, the one hypothesis that I might, that would be nice to be able to study and eventually even test, is that the extent to which given the current systems invest in the type of interventions, for instance, that Anita was advocating at the end of her intervention, should allow at the same time the increase in the involvement of more providers, more investors of different forms of capital, as well as the increase of the integration of more public good in the purpose of the firm, right? The two dimensions I was talking about before. And that should eventually, if those capabilities are developed, again, at the private as well as the public level, at the firm level as well as in the government, then we should see social progress to increase, right? Essentially with the contemporaneous development not only of economic wealth, but also of social well-being across all the various dimensions. That's basically the one way to try to put together the various positions expressed and also generate what I would humbly offer as a possible way to coordinate, by the way, not only within the business research, the management research, but especially if we move to the micro level, to the macro systemic level, it's also our own responsibility as management scholars to learn how to cooperate effectively with other social scientists and eventually even natural scientists. Now, the way that I would understand I would suggest the research agenda could be framed is in fairly logical terms. Understanding the statics of what are the current cost sector. Yeah, I'm almost done. But more importantly, and I will deliver my main message, is understanding the dynamics of learning, how firms learn and how governments learn these fundamental capabilities to create and coordinate the utilization of resources in their own domain and coordinate the hybrid resources. And finally, the experimentation of hybrid forms, not only in terms of experimentation of new type of form, for example, governance system within firms or other forms of systems or intervention, for instance, to develop cultural and leadership models that would be consistent with this view. But also at the systemic level, we have seen economists being able to do randomized controlled trials in poverty, right? Duflo won her and her colleagues won Nobel Prize last year. We should be able to also do something similar in terms of testing the effectiveness of government intervention, policy intervention that would support increasing levels either of hybridity or of stakeholder empowerment. And let me finish on this note. Apologies for being a bit out of time. Mike?
Well, thank you all very much. So that's a lot to take across 4 different views. And Maurizio, I believe you now wanted to run a short panel discussion, and then we'll open it up to general questions.
Yes. So my main curiosity, and I think I can speak for most people in the audience, is clearly to give at least the chance to Peter and Paul and to provide their own view now that we all know what we are we all saying. There was no prior coordination, by the way, to these interventions. And yes, so let's have basically a quick round of comments or even questions. Peter, Paul, and Anita, to each.
Yeah, sorry. If you want to just go in order, I can jump in real quickly.
Sure.
With two quick points. If I had managed my time better, I would have also made the claim that the crises that Paul refers to, or these sort of societal problems, environment, inequality, healthcare, education, and so forth. You know, these are problems that are common to all forms of social organization, right? And we have to be careful not to commit what Demsetz famously called the nirvana fallacy, saying, oh, well, we have this problem in a capitalist society, therefore we should replace it with a socialist society. I don't find that a very compelling argument. What we should be doing is engaging in so-called comparative institutional analysis. So let's look at, both in theory and in history, how the healthcare system, the education system, protection of the environment, social, cultural, economic inequality, and so forth, what do those look like under non-capitalist systems? And I would argue that the crises that Paul is worried about would be exacerbated rather than alleviated if we replaced capitalism with some kind of socialism. Second point is I appreciate Paul's emphasis on his articulation of a kind of socialism in which we would still have management, right? Managers, and we would have enterprises, they would be managed, but the owners would be the state rather than private investors. And therefore the production system would work just as well as it does now, but even better. I think that's a misunderstanding of the problem identified by Mises in 1920. This kind of argument that we could have socialist factories that operate just like capitalist factories was articulated in the 1930s in response to Mises. And Mises pointed out in response to those claims that they kind of misunderstand the problem. The problem is not how to get the plant manager, to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, how to motivate employees and create organizational culture and do all the things that we talk about in organization theory and in strategy. Rather, the real problem is the societal problem, the meta level problem of how to allocate scarce and valuable resources to various activities. It's the project selection problem that is addressed by capitalism through markets and prices, in particular through markets for the ownership of companies. That problem is not solved by any of the market socialist proposals. They sort of take the existing state of technology, the existing allocation of resources to factories as given, and then say, well, the managers should just do the same thing they would have done when they were in private hands. As Mises said in 1949, the problem is not, he said, it's true you can ask socialist factory managers, you can ask socialist supervisors to play manager, but he said you can't get anyone under socialism to play speculation and investment. That's the problem that I don't think the kinds of market socialist proposals or democratic socialist proposals that Paul articulates very well can really solve.
Let's hear what Paul has to say, because this is the critical point, right? How much do we trust markets versus public government to play the role?
When I wrote this book on democratic socialism, I thought my challenge was going to be convincing people that socialism was a good idea. And it turned out I was completely wrong. I bet you if we did take a poll, most people would love the idea of socialism. The drawback and the reason they hesitate is because of the democracy part of it. People don't have faith in democracy as a way of establishing the relative importance of these hybrid purposes that Maurizio was talking about. We don't have faith that a government, albeit ostensibly democratic, could come to some reasoned conclusion about what mix of goals should be brought to bear in the governance of whole industries that they would control and of the enterprises within those industries. It's our lack of faith in democracy that undermines our willingness to entertain the idea that you could have an economy that's planned strategically in much the same way as within firms. They plan the deployment of resources through their strategic management process. And obviously these days we've got lots of reasons to worry about democracy. Some of us are talking from the United States, where those reasons are all too manifest in orange form. But the reason democracy, I would argue, the reason democracy so badly fails us is because it's an apparatus built on top of a capitalist economy. As long as the wealth of the country is still being essentially provided by the capitalist organization of a private sector economy, if if the economy is still fundamentally driven by these capitalist firms, then no government can act powerfully enough to meet society's needs, solve societal problems, when those solutions require crushing the profits of too many elements of the private sector. Just to take the environmental challenge, the climate change crisis. If we could solve this with a carbon tax of 20 bucks a ton, 50 bucks a ton, fine, we would have been there already. But this can't be resolved even if the carbon taxes were set at $200 or $300 or $400 per ton. The folks who've studied this carefully have concluded very clearly that this can't solve our problem, because the problems go much deeper. We don't have to only shut down the fossil fuel industry, but also radically transform all of the industries that depend on fossil fuels for their products or their energy or their processes. And that's transportation, agriculture, mining, lumber, cement, construction, all sorts of consumer products and services. And then we've got to rebuild massive sectors of our, massive spans of our infrastructure to deal with rising sea levels, right? So these are massive problems that cannot be solved without massive impacts on the profitability of large sectors of the private, large parts of the private sector economy. And I don't think it doesn't strike me as difficult to understand why no governments anywhere in the world have taken on this challenge very seriously, if they've got to reconcile themselves to the need to maintain the profitability of the private sector in order to avoid massive job loss, to avoid the loss of legitimacy for government itself attendant to those job losses. Then how could they act forcefully enough to solve a crisis like this? I would make the same argument about the other 5 crises I talk about. They all involve fundamental tensions with the interests of the business sector. And no government, no matter how well-meaning, can deal with that.
So what you're basically saying, market failures are not correctable by market actors.
The big one are not correctable by market actors, are not correctable by governments when they're as massive as the ones we're talking about. There's all sorts of market failures that can be addressed by appropriate regulation and taxation. There's many things that we could be doing within the framework of capitalism that would considerably improve the quality of our lives. I don't have any doubt that the path that Anita sketches for us would be very welcome, right? Well, my point is we'd still be left with a climate crisis. We'd still have an economy that went through periodic collapses. We'd still be left with an economy in which at work people feel quite disempowered from the big issues that affect their lives, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, pardon me. So thank you so much, Paul. You know, I want to say what I really think, which is that I think all of us are both capitalists and socialists. All of us are all private citizens with private interests and public citizens with public interests. And that organizations of all types, including markets and firms and governments and agencies, all of those organizational forms are tools for getting important things done. And I simply could not agree more with Paul that, and Jerry, who has been pushing and developing this agenda for forever, that we are on a road to climate suicide. We are living in a world in which there is untenable, unconscionable, inhumane inequality. We have major movements toward authoritarianism that threaten science and intellectualism and culture and ideas. We have to somehow figure out, as intellectual leaders with responsibility, as stewards in society of knowledge, to inspire the next generation, each other, with better ideas for how to marshal resources to get stuff done, important things done. The list that Paul just described, the Sustainable Development Goals, you know, the achievement of what we think is important. It gets to this point in the chat that we have to think about what we mean by advancing society. We're not talking about constraining consumption marginally here. We're talking about massive constraints on consumption. And you know, one of the things that comes out of the pandemic that I find to be very powerful is that we can accomplish widespread behavioral change. we can do that. We can, regrettably, we can allow a lot of bad restaurants, you know, to potentially fail. That's a capitalist failure, and it's a shame. And I don't mean to be flip. I don't mean to be, you know, I don't want to walk over the pain of people who've lost their small businesses. That's not what I mean. But we do need somehow to achieve the level of behavioral change that we have accomplished this year through coordinated action at scale. And I don't think yet that we as a community, as an intellectual community, have really, you know, gone much further than only begun that conversation. And part of the reason why is because it requires that we be multidisciplinary. We have to be philosophers, we have to be political scientists, we have so many historians, wonderful historians here. David is here, Brent is here. We need those powerful you know, intellectual partners from other disciplines to help us move together on this. But one of the reasons that I'm so thrilled to be here is because I very much want to be committed to being part of that conversation. But this is not something that we can easily accomplish by debating the virtues of capitalism versus socialism. We have to throw every tool that we have and you know, and shut off labels that are going to shut down our discourse and make it harder for us to talk. We have to get to the root of this and start to make really serious progress in our charge, which is to come up with some good ideas for trying to solve these problems.
Anita, we need to go back now to open it up, but let me just add to what you just said, that our responsibility as intellectual community goes beyond producing the ideas. The intellectual progress for sure is key, and the cross-disciplinary capacity is key. It goes also into the change in the way we do our business, right? In actually being able to learn how to engage the actors that have to do the behavioral change. In a way, we have to do the behavioral change first, right? To learn how to do those experimentation work with policymakers, with organizations, with all the various actors, and engage them. We actually don't know. We haven't actually built even the expectation, the absorptive capacity for our main stakeholders to know how to deal with us. If we go and ask them, why don't you try, you know, why don't you do a randomized control trial on changing X, whatever that X is, and whoever the agent, you know, the stakeholder is. That's, I think, for us, an imperative at this stage. So yes, cross-disciplinarity, and by the way, it's not that we have to become, you know, necessarily political scientists and so on, but learning how to work with political scientists and neuroscientists and whatever, environmental scientists, that's hard enough. It's really hard, but in addition to that, really change and at least expand our methodologies and build the type of expectations from businesses as well as governments. And here I want to give it back to Mike so that we can open up and hear questions.
Thanks. So, I mean, there's actually no easy way to determine questions because there's been just a massive conversation going on all along, which brings up another kind of almost natural experiment in central control versus free market decision-making here. But I've been encouraged by some to shut down the chat until at least everybody's done speaking, because it is very hard to pay attention to what's going on in the chat and listen to everybody. I don't know, should I regulate all that or not? I am thinking of maybe shutting it down for a while, but until everybody hears at least the initial inputs, something else to sort out. But, you know, look, I want to make this series and especially this important conversation more than just people talking past each other. And that's incredibly hard to do. And I don't know that we accomplished it here, even though we did unravel a lot of interesting, very specific points. So I want to do as much as I can to just bring this to a very specific head and think about what, and our tools are, we're researchers, what things should we be researching to help us to understand this? And so I'd like, each of you to just answer at whatever level you want, but, are there some assumptions about the behaviors of individuals, teams, organizations, government units, non-government units, societies that need to be better tested to help us to make this distinction about the best form of organizing for a better society? I mean, what are we assuming, and are there things that we should be testing that those folks in the audience might be part of actually revising the research agenda to take account of?
Mike, I wondered if we could ask someone from the audience who wants to speak for, say, a minute or so to raise her or his or their hand and just work it that way, just to get a few more voices in the conversation.
That's fine. But we'll just, can you answer my question, and then we'll see if one of those questions arises, and then we'll go from there.
I'll have a quick one to throw into the mix, if you like, Mike. As I explained, my thinking has been really focused on what we can learn from capitalist firms, strategic management processes that could give us some clue as to how socialism at a national level might meet its challenges. It's occurred to me that a big deficiency of my book is that I didn't spend enough time studying what we already know from the public sector. Most of us on this call are probably teaching in business schools and not schools of management that encompass both private and public sector management. There's been a lot of creative work done over the years in many different countries to ensure that public sector agencies operate according to their democratically defined mandates, with the hybrid goals that Maurizio was talking about embedded in their performance indicators. There's been a lot of creative work done in the public sector by scholars who study the public sector, by actors in the public sector, to meet those challenges. And I think we've got a lot to learn. It's, conservatives in America have done so much to undermine the capacity of our government here that it's pretty easy to be dismissive of that sector as far as its management, lessons for management are concerned. But if you scratch beneath the surface, there's a lot of very creative work, whether it's deliberative democracy, whether it's the way the regulatory processes work for public utilities. There's lots of really rich, interesting lessons there that would shake us up, I think, quite deeply in our conviction that the public sector can't be as efficient as the private sector when it tackles production, routine production type activity.
Okay, so about the efficiency of government. Anybody else have anything specific that they think could be studied to shed light on which direction this should be going?
I would just make a plug for incorporating into the kinds of careful, detailed comparative analyses Paul is pointing us to, consideration of dynamic rather than static conditions, taking uncertainty seriously, thinking about innovation and change. I mean, not to do too much of a plug, Anita and I have done some work on how different kinds of organizations, both public and private, deal with unanticipated change, and how that makes governance problems a lot more complicated than the simple stylized ones that you often find in the textbooks, both in strategy and in organization and in public administration. So being very careful and deliberate about specific mechanisms and thinking about conditions of uncertainty is critical.
All right, thank you.
My main problem is that most of this discussion as of today is missing the control, evidence of what would happen if firm X, for instance, changed its governance structure and the diffusion, for instance, of claims, residual claims to other stakeholders beyond financial investors, for instance. We don't know what would happen, right, in a significant way beyond maybe some case studies, for instance.
Pretty high stakes. Only University of Chicago gets to experiment like that, right? So.
I think we could study COVID, how policies and policy implementation lessons were learned across different forms of government. I think we could examine collaboration in the development of medicines, vaccines, and distribution of PPE and other types of equipment across public and private sector. This has been an enormous, multifaceted interinstitutional effort to try to come up with ways of remediating the pandemic. And there's a lot to be learned from what happened.
Mm-hmm. Was there anybody, nobody's raised their hand, but was there any particular question you wanted anybody to ask?
I did see a couple hands, actually. Okay. I don't know if they're still up. I think they fade a little bit in Zoom. Maybe they could be raised again. There's Brent's hand. Brent? Okay, go ahead. Brent? I don't see any hands anywhere. But...
Yeah, sorry, I was just unmuting. So first of all, I want to thank Mike for organizing. It's been a great discussion. And so I'm just very appreciative of this common good that you've generated. I guess my question is all about politics. It seems that the questions we're debating are not necessarily economic questions, rather they're political questions of how we adjudicate the constraints we put on free enterprise. And for example, I put up in the chat, fuel emissions standards for automobiles in the United States. That's a political outcome that constrains the nature of products that we allow in the marketplace in some way. And that simultaneously allows us to use the innovation capacity of free enterprise towards a common goal. But I don't know of any other system to adjudicate these trade-offs where some are going to win and some are going to lose as political. So yeah, Anita just said everything's political. So I agree. So I guess I wonder why Paul believes that politics cannot resolve these problems and instead we need to blow the system up.
Well, because the answer is fairly simple. It's that politics within a capitalist society based on a capitalist economy has to pay homage to the profit imperatives experienced by the capitalist firms in the economic sector. And that's just a fundamental constraint on any government, no matter how well-meaning. If you alienate your business class, they take their marbles and go play elsewhere. They don't need to invest. When Mitterrand proposed a pretty modest series of nationalizations in 1981 in France, hundreds of millions of dollars left the country within the span of a few days when he got elected. You know, this happens time and time again. And it's not, I don't blame the capitalist class. They're doing what they need to do. But, you know, as long as you've got an economy in which they're the key players, governments is in thrall to their interests.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's Glass-Steagall emerged in the 1930s, which I can't believe the bankers were too insupportive, and that regulation lasted quite effectively for 50 years or not more. I mean, I agree that it was eroded away, but it's not, but it was created in the first place. And in fact, most of our social safety systems came out of the political process, and they are certainly not in the best interests of the top 1%. Or at least they're not perceived to be. I might disagree with that statement, but they certainly lobby against them. And it is a very plausible scenario that many corrections will happen in conditional on certain election outcomes in the United States in 3 or 4 months. But like those are not implausible statements. And so I guess I just question again, as the salience of the crisis increases, politics often solves these problems.
Yeah, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but you raise a terrific question, Brent, and we should all be thinking deeply about it. But let's get some other voices into the mix, maybe.
Wayne Eastman, do you have a question?
Yeah, kind of. Thanks, Mike, and seconding the thanks for putting this on into all of our able presenters and moderators and discussants. You know, kind of a response on the promising avenues of research. I mean, there's a nice colloquy that's been going on in chat with, I think, the real world correlate of this, which is the respective merits of the more inegalitarian American variety of capitalism and the more egalitarian Scandinavian variety. I realize we have much bigger fish to fry, but at the practical level, people are interested in that, rightly. And one of my colleagues, I won't mention who if she wants to speak up, but put in a reasoned brief position in favor of the Nordic model, a somewhat smaller pie, but more equally shared. I think an interesting perspective on that debate is the claim by Acemoglu, Robinson, Verdier, that the Nordic model in some sense depends on positive externalities, innovations that spill over from the cutthroat model. So cuddly capitalism in their model depends on cutthroat capitalism to some real degree. But is that true? Is the big time innovation really coming out of the United States? A certain nationalism or ethnocentrism may lead our predominantly American group to say so, but is that really true? Do we here in the land of cutthroat capitalism really invent all the cool stuff in music, and in Sweden say they borrow, or in tech, we invent all the cool stuff and they borrow in Germany or Japan? But is that right? That's an empirical question. So I think some of the political economy issues, not necessarily at the extremely broad level that Paul is talking about, democratic socialism is an untried system, but very much tried alternatives of capitalism, some with a more socialistic flavor, some with a more capitalist flavor. I really think there's great potential for empirical political economy work.
Can I just make a small clarification to reiterate a point I made earlier in my presentation? The Nordic countries score higher on measures of economic freedom than the United States. In Denmark, the corporate tax rate is 22%. In the US, it's 26%. I mean, let's not attribute the success of the Nordic countries, whether it's in the economic realm or the social and cultural realm, to some kind of socialism. Those are in many ways more capitalist countries than you have in the US or Canada or Japan.
Indeed, a good topic to continue on the definition of respective elements, such as exactly what you say, Peter, excellent points, and countervailing points relating to, for instance, rates of marginal taxation, rates of redistribution, and so on. But good, yeah.
Perhaps one way to explain, again, with very simple dimensions, the difference is that Nordic countries have a higher tolerance for hybridity, right? And can handle, and firms can handle collaboration and integration of interests of different, higher numbers of stakeholders, beyond the workers and customers, which obviously are the obvious ones. You can claim that that's what makes for a more mature and advanced form of capitalism.
So we've hit the time limit. I don't know how many people still want to stick around. I'm glad to leave this open for anyone who wants to continue with additional questions and discussion. But first, let me just formally end it by first just thanking all of our panelists. My God, that was just a lot to take, and that was a lot of very, very good insights. So I'll clap. I don't know how many others you can hear, but thank you all for being a part of this. A reminder that the next one will be on November 13th, same bat time, same bat place, on the question of, does corporate social and environmental responsibility create value for consumers? And there we have Caroline Flammer in the affirmative, Mike Lennox in the negative. It depends with Magali Delmas, and the moderator is Tim Davini. So I do hope you'll join us for that. Again, thank you very much. This stuff will be posted online. You'll receive a link, probably a Dropbox link to allow you to see the recordings and all the associated material. Thanks for participating. We'll stick around. Anybody who wants to stick around.